Peace and Blessings, Part 10 of X, There Was a Man, the Saga of Gordon Kahl, a True Story. Top of page 78. 10-4 said Cheshire. Cleveland copied. You figured out that puzzle? I can't. Too many witnesses or what? Maybe Muir was crawfishing a little, having second thoughts about a confrontation momentarily? I learned all this from a radio scanner reports. Complying with the marshal's desire, Deputy Sheriff Brad Capp had kept my grandpa's automobile under surveillance from a southerly direction, remaining in his pickup about a block away using binoculars. He slid down in the driver's seat with his transceiver as the meeting broke up and some attendees came outside. He was to get into the Ram Charger within a few minutes, assisting the marshals at their request. Earlier, he had rebuffed Darrell Graff's request to call the whole thing off, one reason being that the marshals were already on their way. Similarly, he ignored Graff's advice not to participate. Medina Police Chief Darrell Graff, who also provided contract police protection for Missile, North Dakota, was requested to join the marshals. He declined, sensing the great potential for trouble, which he thought to be unnecessary. It was like a tornado coming up, and I couldn't do a thing about it, he later remarked. Graff was admittedly scared of the developments. Graff had been attending meetings concerning farm foreclosure problems and a proposed constitutional township. These had been held during the past several weeks at Ashley and at the Medina Clinic, hosted by Dr. Clarence Martin, who was concerned about British Israelism. Such a meeting was held starting at 2 p.m. on the 13th at the clinic. Graff did not attend, saying later that he had not been notified. Not so. Just as Kahl and some others were armed at the earlier meeting, so was Graff, who once brought a Colt AR-15 weapon in a guitar case. He later said it was for a joke. Graff had learned of the APB and had notified Dr. Martin of the assertion that a federal warrant of some sort was outstanding for Kahl, incorrectly presuming Dr. Martin might want to disassociate himself from such a person. He also notified another regular attendee, David Brower, including his incorrect conjecture that Quabbah and Kahl had threatened the Minot sheriff. Brower, a well-educated paralegal, had helped him with some legal problems. Sensing that trouble was likely that Sunday evening, Graff contacted and assembled several voluntary ambulance and medical rescue personnel at the fire hall, located on the highway leading north out of town. At least I hope we can save Dave's life, he commented, referring to Brower, with whom he had talked on the telephone twice during the past hour. Officer Steve Schnabel, who worked for Graff, was still dressed in his camouflage military fatigues when he responded to Muir's request for assistance. He had been attending a weekend National Guard drill. Graff told him, I wouldn't send anybody into an area I wouldn't go, and Graff was not going, but he did not prohibit Schnabel from doing so. Muir and Wigglesworth in Muir's car and Schnabel in his green Mercury police car set up a roadblock by a grain elevator near the fire station. Graff requested that they move further north on Road 68 to prevent danger to the townspeople. They moved to a point about a mile north of the town. After being assured the lakes on each side of the road would prevent any evasion or escape route. The two vehicles were parked in a V heading south at that point. The plan was for the Ram Charger to follow from behind Grandpa's car. Cheshire and Hobson were in the front seat of the Charger, Cap in the back. In an unrelated event, a car caught fire near the fire hall, and some of the emergency personnel went to it and extinguished the blaze. They were there when the shooting started. About the same time, a little green sports car passed the fire station heading north. Graff chased it down quickly. Mark and Carol Laninka had been visiting relatives and were en route home. They were told, get the hell out of here. There's going to be a shootout, and this time the police are in the wrong. They retreated a distance and waited. Graff then became agitated because of the situation, later explaining, "Just standing there and let everything go to hell around you." Stanley Hinham drove his city pickup over the hill towards the roadblock scene and then returned back in a ways, then turning the vehicle around. After Cap told him, "Get the hell out of here," he had not known about the roadblock. Stanley had been performing his twice-a-day duties of greasing the sewer station, one on each side of the Reardon farm. When he arrived at the fire station, he asked Graff about what was going on. Darrell replied, They have a tax evader down there, and they're going to shoot him." Graff instructed the dispatcher to call the Reardons, who lived in the trailer home near the roadblock. He did so, informing them to go back to the room and stay down. The time was approaching 6 p.m., but it was yet broad daylight on the prairie. Grandma and Grandpa were delighted with the beautiful Sunday morning, nicest day of the winter. They had planned on attending church in Heaton, but Grandpa said, "It's such a nice day, and since weather permits, maybe I had better get to the Rambler in good running order at the farm, so that if we move back there, you'll have a car to drive to work." The afternoon was reserved for the township meeting in Medina. Joan went to church, and Gordon worked on the car nearby. Scott Fall was at his farm near Harvey, some 40 miles from Heaton, with his charming wife Shauna and their 5 children. He was immensely concerned about farm foreclosures and interested in other constitutional issues, and planned to attend the township meeting in Medina that day. One thing puzzled him, causing some to wonder. Why hadn't the court rescheduled his hearing date? This concerned his taking the children out of public school and enrolling them in a private school. This was after the school sought to provide his first grader with sex training that fall. Before even teaching him the ABCs, Sheriff Kurt Pellet had served a warrant on him for truancy the evening prior to court date. On that day, the sheriff and deputy were already there when he arrived home, and they had gone to the barn when Shauna had not answered the door, ignoring their shouts. Scott went into the house to check on his family, answering the door, then, with his mini 14 at ready, poured arms. Knowing that the state sometimes removed children from parental custody, he didn't want them bothering his wife and children without a court hearing. Pellet claims Scott pointed the rifle at his midsection. Scott denies this. The officers left after they stuck the warrant in the door or threw it on the floor, depending on whose version is correct. Scott called the lame duck judge, got a continuance because of the short notice. Nothing was ever heard about it again. He and the sheriff had argued earlier about Yori's pistol. Whatever the reason, Scott and Shauna had a minor disagreement on that Sunday morning, and Scott had departed for the Medina meeting without kissing her goodbye and telling her he loved her, as he usually did. Scott went to Uncle Yori's first as planned. Yori was undecided as to whether to go to the meeting or not. His wife Janice would be left with their 2 children and was expecting another in late spring. Since Scott's vehicle was low on fuel, Grandpa suggested they all go in his station wagon. "Hey, we might kill some rabbits on the way," Scott said to Yori. "Go back and get your rifle." Yori did this and got his pistol too. They did kill a jackrabbit while en route, which both of them went to fetch from a field. Hunting was so second nature to them that they later had trouble remembering who actually shot the rabbit. The meeting had started when they arrived shortly after 2 p.m. Bible verses were being read. Grandpa and Dr. Martin immediately engaged in a heated discussion over eligibility for membership in the township. Grandpa desired a more restricted membership than did Clarence Martin and his following. Several attendees, including Scott, Yori, Grandpa, and David Bower, had weapons at the meeting, as was usual. When asked by one attendee to explain the guns, my granddad said, "We need to assert our constitutional rights more actively. Bearing arms was one way to do this." The township, which emphasized political ideals more than a geographical area, was an attempt to foster individual rights. Dave Brower and his wife Joni were paralegals who had moved to Streator, North Dakota from Oregon. He drove to the meeting in his small AMC Hornet station wagon, accompanied by his friend Vernon Wagner, a former Streator policeman. As usual, Brower brought along his small shotgun, which had a fold-down stock loaded with birdshot. About 15 persons attended Dr. Martin's meeting at the clinic on the east side of town, including Lynn Martin of Ashley and Moritz Inquest and Russell Larson of Oaks. 2 women were there, one of whom who had brought Joan a box of potatoes from Kahl. The women sat together at the meeting, visiting but not participating. The meeting did not go well, as Dr. Martin and Grandpa could not reconcile their differences concerning religious and racial composition of the township. Scott and Yori backed Gordon. The others, including Joan, passively were generally sympathetic to Dr. Martin's views. David Brower were neutral and assumed his traditional role as conciliator and mediator. The meeting broke shortly after 5 o'clock when Grandpa walked out to the north side of the clinic saying, "Anyone else coming?" Yori and Joan followed, with Joan saying, "Well, I guess I'd better go too." Then Scott left saying, "If I want to ride, I better go." Shortly, Brower said, "Hey, I want to catch those guys before they leave," and followed them out. Grandpa asked Dave whether or not they could continue the township discussion on another day. Dave explained that Sunday evening was his only available time, but maybe he could drive home with Grandpa for further discussion on the way. Wagner, who had come with David, was given alternative rides home, but chose to go with David and the group. Grandma took her seat in the front passenger seat of their Chrysler, where she remained. The others spied a man in the pickup watching them. Yori pointed at him. Everyone but Joan returned inside, where Dr. Martin identified the man as Bradley Cap. He had attended an earlier meeting. Several wanted to go to the pickup and confront Cap as to what his purpose was. Dave suggested they not do it, and Grandpa concurred. Instead, Dave called Darrell Graff concerning the APB he had mentioned earlier. Graff said the APB was for Rusty Quaba and another man. After a brief discussion following the call, someone suggested calling him back to get a check on the vehicle involved. Dave called Graff again, this time motioning for Yori and Scott to listen on the extension. The license number was 1906, Scott's Oldsmobile. This puzzled and upset Scott. He was shocked. "That's my car," he said, and explained how his wife was using it during the week to do laundry at her sister's and such. Some of the others were a little disconcerted also. The concern was about Scott, not Grandpa. Graff had been careful not to mention Kahl's name, knowing what was coming down. Graff had been careful not to mention Kahl's name, knowing what was coming down. Scott was also concerned that his wife and children might go visiting in the Olds and be apprehended. His apprehension was increased by his recent reading of a man, John Singer, in another state, Utah, being shot in the back at his mailbox after he had taken his children out of public school. Scott was scared. I say again, conversations in the clinic centered on Fall and the APB, not on Gordon Kahl. Grandpa, Scott, and Yori came back out and got into the car. Scott asked Grandpa to drive to the south side of the clinic as he wanted to talk with a couple of people, especially Lynn Martin. About this time, someone drove up in a dark-colored station wagon and told Grandpa, "I think you're being set up." He then drove off. Grandpa got the potatoes from the pickup and put them in the station wagon. The men went inside the clinic. While there, Yori insisted that Gordon and himself switch coats. Yori took Grandpa's bright blue cap and coat, giving him his brown coat and brown stocking cap. Yori borrowed from Lynn Martin. Grandpa and Lynn shook hands. It was agreed that Gordon would ride with Dave in the small AMC and the others would follow in the Kahl Chrysler, with Yori driving. Scott was seated behind Yori and Wagner was behind Grandma. In the event of any trouble, Dave Brower planned to serve as peacemaker. However, they did not really expect trouble. Warnings had been received before. Earlier, Grandma had expressed a desire to stay at the clinic if there was going to be any trouble. Grandpa reassured her that there would be no trouble. The two cars headed north out of town. Yori noticed the Ram Charger was following them and commented on it. Their conversation mainly concerned what distance to stay from the front vehicle, except for that. As Grandpa and Broer topped Cheese Factory Hill, just past the elevator, they noticed two vehicles in the road about a mile ahead. The one in their lane, which they learned later was Schnabel's green Mercury police car, turned on its red flasher light. The two station wagons turned left into the Reardon's driveway entrance and stopped, side by side. While Yori was trying to explain to his dad through the rolled-down windows the fact that a four-wheel drive was following, Broer backed out to head back south. His small car was mostly in the southbound lane, heading generally south. Anything to avoid trouble or confrontation, Grandpa and Dave were surely thinking. Chapter 15, Countdown. The Ram Charger topped the hill with a roar at high speed. Cheshire slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop. Catty-cornered across the road as he turned left to block the southbound lane. The marshals were opening the doors before the Charger stopped. Their weapons were already pointed out the windows. As they were skidding, Gordon prepared to get out of the Hornet and stand in the V of the door with his Mini Ruger 14. A red flasher light on the dash soon came on in the cab of the Ram Charger. Yori and Scott had not dismounted at this point. "You're going to die," one of the marshals yelled, and then Cheshire and Cap chuckled. "Throw down your weapons or we're going to blow your DAMN heads off. We're going to blow your effing heads off." Cheshire screamed. Ironically, he was the only head eventually blown off. Hobson also yelled the same threat. Scott turned to Yori. "What the hell's going on?" "I don't know," Yori responded fearfully, leaving the driver's seat with his Mini 14. He sidestepped in a half-moon route around the 4-foot ditch southward to a telephone pole, the only other cover he could find, constantly facing the Ram. At this point, he was nearly 10 yards from the Charger. He pointed his rifle at Cheshire, who was already aiming his rifle at Yori. "I don't think I can miss," Cheshire blurted. "This is an automatic." Yori did not respond, but his heart was beating so hard that it seemed to want to leap out of his throat, to burst his chest. "Hey, how about you lay down your weapons and back off?" Grandpa exclaimed. "Let's talk this over." The countdown stalemate was to continue for another 8 minutes, a Mexican standoff. Police scanner reports helped to record events. Hobson immediately stood outside the passenger side of the Ram with his shotgun pointing. Realizing the open door was a little additional protection to his flak jacket, he went to the east ditch across the road. He radioed Muir. Time 5:46. Jim Hobson. "Come in. They got 3 carbines. Ken, let's call in more units." Ken Muir. "We're here." Muir's vehicle was way up the road to the north. Bob Cheshire. "Is that a 10-4, Ken?" Ken. "Tell them to drop 'em." Bob. "We're doing that. They're not doing it. Let's call in some more units, 10-4. Ken. 10-4, we got 'em coming. Highway patrolman. 5:47. Bob. "You're cutting out. Let's go in. Permission to call in more units, Ken." Ken. "Can I call in more units? 26, come on. We need them closer. Pull them in closer. We're looking right in the faces of these guys. Let's go. You guys reading us? We got one behind a telephone pole. We got one in a station wagon and one in a Hornet. Copy?" Steve Schnabel. 10-4. 5:48. Jim. "Hey, you guys, bring yourselves up here. We're standing looking these guns right in the face. Come up behind them. You've already got one pointing in your direction. We've got 2 pointing in our direction. Get in the damn car and move this way." Muir and Schnabel then moved their cars southward in tandem, timorously and cautiously stopping some 75 yards north of the driveway. Hobson was obviously upset that they didn't come in closer, which they did after the following transmissions. 5:52. Ken. "Is the subject here? Is he one of these guys?" Bob. Apparently, he's in the station wagon. Ken, he's still there, okay? Bob, Ken, apparently he's changed clothes. Cap, said he thinks he's in there, but he's not sure. Muir had earlier been told that Gordon was wearing a bright blue jacket and cap. 5:52. Ken, are you in contact with one of those guys there at all? Bob, we're all talking to one of the guys. The guy is the driver and owner here, and is the one looking out toward you. Ken, can we talk to these people at all? 5:53. Bob, I don't know, hang on, somebody's moving. Ken, I think it would help a little bit if you guys would get in a little closer. We're right down the barrel with these guys. Wegener had backed up the station wagon a few feet. Ken, yeah, we'll come in. The two roadblocker vehicles then moved. 5:54. Ken, what's this guy that's got the gun? What's he saying? I mean, is he saying anything? What's the problem? For the third time, Gordon said, lay down your guns and back off. According to witnesses, this time he added, it's not worth someone getting killed over. A statement the government later tried to attribute to Hobson. Bob, they're not saying anything. The only one we're talking to, Ken, is the passenger, Gordon, in the small sedan right here. Bradley Cap exited the unmarked Ram Charger with a 12-gauge pump shotgun loaded with double-aught buckshot. His attention from the vehicle rear was focused on Yorrie at the pole. When Hobson went to the ditch, Cap moved up and replaced him behind the passenger door of the vehicle. With his red beard and shoulder-length frizzled hair, he did not give the impression of one who is a federal marshal. They all looked like farmers to me. Yorrie was to later relate, referring to the fact that none were in uniform. Hobson, however, wore a cap with an embroidered marshal's emblem on it. Who was looking? No badges were evident. Nevertheless, the Kahl contingent suspected they were lawmen. Wegener remained motionless in his seat in the back of the Kahl Chrysler. He was unarmed. When the station wagon tended to go forward slightly, he got out, walked around to the driver's seat, and backed the vehicle for a short distance, remaining in the seat, or the floorboard thereafter, next to Grandma. All right, we'll end that at the top of page 88. So we'll pick up the next part at the top of page 88. Keep in mind, this is a 237-page book, so we're not even halfway done.